Hello everybody and welcome back to Revolutionary Left Radio. On today's episode I have a really interesting sort of episode that was put together at the last minute because of the time-sensitive nature of what we came across. I have back on the show Aaron Leonard from our Heavy Radicals episode and our Folk Artist, Communist Party, and FBI episode, and he's here with his co-author on Heavy Radicals as well as a second book that I've never had a chance to do an episode on, A Threat of the First Magnitude, and that is Conor Gallagher. So Aaron and Conor recently, I think it was Aaron, that reached out, filed a FOIA request years and years ago regarding the COINTELPRO program, regarding Fred Hampton, etc. And I think it was in 2015, and only in December 4th of 2020, the 51st anniversary of Fred Hampton's assassination, he finally got back some of the documents he had been looking for, and he came to Rev Left to open up that FOIA document and share some of the stuff that he learned. It doesn't radically alter the picture of the Fred Hampton assassination, but it does give us more insights. And throughout this episode, we do the important job of complicating simplistic narratives that people might have about the COINTEL program. I think it's really important to do that. As they say throughout this episode, we have to understand the way that such programs as the COINTELPRO operate and how they actually do it, not fall into some sort of simplistic elementary understanding of these things if we ever hope to be able to move for a better world, for social justice, because the moment that people move towards an organization of power that can make a better, more just, more egalitarian society rooted around values of justice and truth, organizations like the FBI, like police departments, and like the CIA will come down on those people and those organizations. So I think this is really interesting, especially in light of the new film Judas and the Black Messiah, which we talk about towards the end of this discussion, to just have a revisiting of the Fred Hampton assassination, some new evidence about it, some clearing up of some sort of sloppy understandings regarding COINTELPRO, and much more. It's a really wonderful conversation. I always enjoy talking with Aaron, and this time we actually got to have Conor on as well, which is a real honor. I also want to remind listeners, some of you may know this, but we did a whole episode on Fred Hampton, really charting out the entire story in great detail. If you haven't heard that episode, I'll link to it in the show notes. So this will be a sort of a revisitation of the assassination of Fred Hampton, but we do have that entire full episode on Fred Hampton that if you haven't heard, I'll definitely link to, and you can go check out as well. Really quickly, I do just want to mention, because I don't get a chance to say it on the episode, that I watched Judas and the Black Messiah. It is a work of drama. I think it did a good job at humanizing the story, of humanizing Fred Hampton. I thought that they were going to whitewash out the socialism and the radical politics as much as they could, and they didn't to a large extent. But it is also important to remember that it's a work of art, not a work of history necessarily. And that point is made in this conversation as well at the end of the conversation when we talk about our thought on the film. It was heartbreaking, though, because the Fred Hampton story is a heartbreaking story. I love Fred Hampton and what he stood for, and seeing that the history that I knew happened in the abstract, seeing it play out in dramatized form, it broke my heart all over again. And by the end of it, me and my wife were both in tears, and it's just a testament to how fucking tragic the loss of Fred Hampton was, and how just absolutely brutal and cruel and unjust this government can be. Which I know I'm not breaking any news to people listening to this show, but we're seeing it now with what's going on in Texas. Just this absolute barbarity when it comes to this failed state that we know as the United States of America. Something has to change. And people like Fred Hampton, they point in the direction of the change that we need. So without further ado, let's get into this wonderful conversation with Aaron and Conor on new FOIA documents and the assassination of Fred Hampton. Enjoy.
My name is Aaron Leonard. I'm a writer and historian based in Los Angeles. I've been doing research on repression and radicalism in the second half of the 20th century. I've written several books. The first two were collaborations, essentially focused on U.S. Maoism with Conor Gallagher, who I will introduce now.
Hi, this is Conor Gallagher. As Aaron mentioned, we both worked on two books related to FBI infiltration and monitoring of U.S. Maoism with heavy radicals, as well as the second book, Threat of the First Magnitude, and continuing to do research related to COINTELPRO and post-World War II communist groups in the U.S.
Absolutely. Well, it's an honor to have both of you on. Rev Left listeners will be familiar with Aaron. We've had Aaron on a couple times to discuss the book you worked on together with Conor, Heavy Radicals, as well as the new book on folk artists, the Communist Party and the FBI. Conor is new to the show, so welcome. But let's go ahead and dive into it. And the reason that we're going to have this conversation today is mostly in part or in entirety the fact that you had access to some new FOIA documents. So maybe that's the best place to start this conversation off. Could you tell us about your FOIA request, what new information you discovered recently in some of those documents, and sort of why it's important?
Well, I was researching events in Chicago in 1969 because so much was happening there. The last SDS, Students for a Democratic Society convention, the trial of the Chicago 8, which turned into the Chicago 7, the Weathermen and the Days of Rage, and of course the murder of Fred Hampton on December 4th. One of the files I asked for was for Special Agent Roy Martin Mitchell, who I knew was the handler of William O'Neill, who was a key FBI informant and played a pretty critical role in the murder of Fred Hampton. So this was 4 or 5 years ago. That I filed, and I had kind of, you file these things and you either get stuff or you wait or you never get things. But I went to my mailbox on December 4th, which is the anniversary of Hampton's killing, and there was a compact disc from the FBI with the file of Roy Martin Mitchell, which had a number of very interesting things, some of which I'll talk about later. But among them was a letter directly to Special Agent Mitchell from J. Edgar Hoover, written, within a week of the murder of Fred Hampton, basically giving him an incentive bonus of $200 for valuable work related to the Black Panther Party. So that actually was another critical piece of evidence in the murder of Fred Hampton that showed that the FBI, played a significant role in that operation. So that's kind of the background.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about who these actors were. Now, the movie we're going to talk about at the end here, Judas and the Black Messiah, just came out. A lot of people are talking about that, so people who have seen that movie or who are familiar with the Fred Hampton story will probably know who these figures are. But just to sort of remind people and to elaborate on what you discovered, can you talk a bit about who Roy Martin Mitchell was, who William O'Neill was, and sort of how they came to work together initially?
Yeah, well, Roy Mitchell's an FBI agent, and he's a special agent, so he's a rank and file investigation. He's not in leadership hierarchy. Basically, he becomes aware that William O'Neill had crossed state lines in a stolen car, making him subject to federal laws. According to William O'Neill, who this really wonderful resource, Eye on the Prize, the filmmaker interviewed a lot of these key sources from the Black Freedom Movement, both the King era and the Black Liberation era. But he interviews William O'Neill, and O'Neill recounts how Mitchell approached him and said, I know you did it, but it's no big thing. I'm sure we can work it out. And, I think a few months passed before I heard from him again. And one day I got a call and he told me that it was payback time. He said, I want you to go and see if you can join the Black Panther Party. And if you can, give me a call. And then O'Neill actually does go and join the Panthers. He's one of the first Panthers in the Chicago chapter, in the officially sanctioned chapter. Conor can talk more about kind of the relevance of that in terms of the Bureau's doctrine and stuff, but getting O'Neill in early is very significant.
Yeah, so one of the things we began to get an understanding of with the first book, Heavy Radicals, but especially much more with Threat of the First Magnitude, is we began to realize largely, I think, how we've understood the FBI and its COINTEL program has mostly been incorrect in the sense of we essentially relied largely on the media files that were taken in 1971, right? That sort of blew open COINTELPRO.
Media Pennsylvania.
Media Pennsylvania, to avoid confusion. And so those are largely what we based our understanding of COINTELPRO on, right? So the earliest books used those because that was all that was available. And while people have requested FBI files for different areas of research, it hasn't really been pulled together to figure out what we understand now that there's so many more files available. And what we really began to understand is the way the FBI targets organizations is they essentially try to get in very early to any organization they see as a threat, get in on the ground floor, and that way it's much easier to get up into positions of leadership. And we've seen this also with other groups in Chicago, right? So in Chicago actually was probably the most sophisticated area the FBI was doing work, because this is the area in which the FBI created a fake Maoist organization, the Ad Hoc Committee, Marxist-Leninist Party, and pretended to be a communist force in the movement, and doing this under the cover of being a secret group within the Communist Party. And they built up a lot of credibility this way, right? So they had a fair amount of experience doing this, and they began to realize that it's easiest to get into leadership positions if you get into positions early. Hence, this would be the reason they would be trying to start a new chapter somewhere, right? If you start a new chapter, then it's much easier to be in the leadership. Then it's much easier to be in touch with something like national leadership. And this is the doctrine they really developed, hence William O'Neill. Now, William O'Neill, he's obviously telling this story many years later, his recollection, but the most likely thing is he probably went down, and some accounts say he went down the first day the Black Panthers actually opened their Illinois office, which would make sense, right? Because here is now an opening to say, oh, here's a reason why this person who doesn't actually know any of these people would have a reason to actually get in contact with them.
Yeah, so to add to that, right? So there's this doctrine the Bureau has about trying to get people in on the ground floor. I don't think Conor and I had been plugged into the Hampton issue too much until this thing landed in the mailbox, and then one thing leads to another, and you really want to understand it. I discovered a couple of weeks ago there's this huge document dump put up by the FBI as a result of a law that was passed by Congress in '92 to disclose all the information related to the JFK and MLK killing murders. So there's like all this stuff that's somehow tangentially related to those cases. I found this 1,600-page document that details a lot of what the FBI was doing against the Chicago Black Panther Party. And it has quite a number of reports from Roy Mitchell reporting on what he's learning, including what he's learning from an informant. O'Neill's name is still redacted in these. But one of the things I found is that O'Neill is reporting, or at least we believe it's O'Neill is reporting, that he's being put in line to take over Bobby Rush's position as Minister of Defense if Bobby Rush goes to prison. This is like in May 1969. I don't think anybody knows this. I've never seen this anywhere. And I mean, it literally says Hampton is allegedly considering approaching O'Neill to see if he will take over as acting Minister of Defense if Rush goes to jail. At the time, Bobby Rush was facing jail for possession of an unregistered weapon, which was one of the major ways the FBI wanted to go after, a certain kind of radical, any kind of legal means. They would leverage that. But, the prospect of O'Neill actually moving up the hierarchy is suggested here. I don't want to make more of it than what it is, but it is, significant, especially since, we detail in our book A Threat of the First Magnitude, this character Don Wright, an African-American man in Chicago who claims to have been in the Black Panther Party. And he gets up into the Central Committee and then the Secretariat of this Maoist group, the Revolutionary Union. So, the FBI is very much locked in on the Black Panthers at this point. And, they don't have resources in place because it's all starting very new. But O'Neill is there in the ground floor. And I don't think it's been quite appreciated just how strategic he was. And of course, his role in the killing is it's both appalling, but it's also critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is really important to just reemphasize is that the common understanding, even on the left, is when you think about COINTELPRO, when you think about infiltration and informants, you think about it sort of an organization is built up, they get momentum behind them, and then the FBI starts putting people in. But this whole idea of working from the ground floor, even creating organizations wholesale in order to command the entire sort of leadership structure from the floor up from the very beginning, I think is really important to think about. And so, yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. Another thing that you mentioned that I wanted to talk a little bit about, because I think this is also not very well known, is the Red Squad. So what was the Red Squad? How did it relate to the FBI's COINTEL program? And what was its overall relationship to the repression of the Black Panther Party, specifically, obviously, in Chicago?
So the Red Squad is just sort of a shorthand term for what we could call sort of the secret police or the political police within police departments in various cities, right? So within Chicago, they had the largest one, and it was quite brutal, right? And so what you realize is even though the FBI might give information from the police or get information from the police, they actually tend to work in very different ways. For example, if you look at the files related to the Chicago Red Squad, it's much cruder. It's much more simple. They're not doing the sort of intelligence gathering in the way that the FBI does, right? They're just getting sort of basic ideas of this person, this group at this location. You know, it's not actually, if you look at the FBI files in comparison, it's much more sophisticated in terms of here's what this person said, here's what that person said, here's where we think there's differences, here's where we think we can push and maybe create some division between these leaders. Here's where we see tensions between this group and another group, and maybe we can actually create a division between these groups. There's nothing like that, and I think that's partially reflected in the approach that the Chicago police would take versus the FBI. And there's actually an interesting contrast to this is while the Panthers get more in the crosshairs of the police as well as the FBI in Chicago, we can see the approach are quite different, right? So in June of 1969, the FBI carries out a raid on the Chicago Panther office. They do this under the cover of essentially they're looking for a Panther who's a fugitive, and theoretically, since he's crossed state lines, this would make it a federal case. So this is often how the FBI will do something, right? They're very much looking for a legal pretext to carry out their agenda. The police don't seem to be that concerned with all the legal pretexts of things, right? They're much more kicking in doors. And then you compare that to the type of raids they would carry on, that would very much end up with like shootouts, the famous case of them actually arresting Panthers and then setting the office on fire and claiming it came from a stray bullet that somehow happened after Panthers had already been arrested. So, and we can see these difference in approach. The FBI really is concerned about thoughts and ideology, you know, and we'll get to this later when we talk about the Messiah. So there is information that the FBI will share with the Chicago police and going the other direction too. But what's interesting is, as Aaron mentioned, the case of D.H. Wright, Don Wright, who's in the RU, is I actually found his file in the Chicago Red Squad files, and they have no idea he's an FBI informant. It's very clear the FBI is not sharing information about who their informants are with the police at all.
Yeah, and just to add that on the Red Squad in Chicago, I think one of the takeaways I have from getting this new file and this piece that Conor and I are working on finalizing is there's an awful lot more we don't know than we think. It's my sense when people talk about Fred Hampton, they speak of it from the standpoint of, well, you know, we know everything. And maybe some people have never been initiated into all the details, and here they are. I think it's our view that there is, I'll use the word, a universe of information that's not known. One thing, for example, I mean, I just stumbled across this yesterday. You know, Conor talked about, he actually went to Chicago and looked at the Chicago Police Subversive Activities Unit files. They're held in a museum. You can't really quote them. You can look at them, but unless you have permission, you can't really reference them, unless, of course, somebody's passed away, such as the case of Don Wright. So, it's really constrained. But then I came across this yesterday. In the fall of 1974, the Red Squad destroyed 105,000 individual and 1,300 organizational files when it learned that the Alliance to End Repression was filing a lawsuit. So in other words, who killed Fred Hampton? Well, it seems like the Chicago Police Department and the FBI worked together to create that, awful event. And there is an awful lot about the role of the Chicago police intelligence that potentially we do not know. And they did work in concert. So that's the thing. And then the other thing we don't know is Muckrock, who do a lot of trying to get information, dislodged from the FBI. They're waiting on William O'Neill's file, but the FBI is charging them huge amounts of money to get it. We don't have the FBI file of Marlon Johnson, who was the station chief in Chicago. So, all of these things will tell us much more about this case. And, just a word, it's like, and I think it's going to get more complicated before it gets simpler, but that's okay. I'd rather understand it as it actually was than to have a kind of a pat version. But I did want to include that on the intelligence stuff. It's just shocking that so much is just missing it, and it's not even being looked for because there's an assumption we already know.
Yeah.
I just want to add one thing on that raid, which is with that FBI raid, besides the fact that it was vastly different in terms of compared to the police ones, there were 8 people arrested, but all their charges were dropped. And why were their charges dropped? Because the FBI didn't want to reveal who their informant was. They really valued how important it was having an informant constantly providing information, whereas the Chicago police seem to be much more brutal, kick-ass, get people in jail, and occasionally put bullets in people.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that is incredibly important to understand that. And with this film and stuff, and just with the retelling of the story, which we've done on this show as well, there is a tendency to sort of feel like we more or less know the whole story. And the fact that this is an open-ended thing, more documents are inevitably going to come out, I think is a very important thing to keep in mind. And that's true for multiple agencies. I mean, we just did an episode on another show recently on MK Ultra. And everything we know about MK Ultra, which is a CIA program, was a CIA program, it comes from a very slim amount of documents that survived a purging of documents when the CIA knew that these documents could possibly come out. So everything we know about the MK Ultra is a fraction of the actual documentation that once existed on it. Now, we'll probably never have access to those files, but it just speaks to this larger point that there is much more that we don't know when it comes to all of this. And that's always something that's worth keeping in mind. This might be a naive question, but before we move on, does the Red Squad in some form still exist? Is it something that multiple, if you know this, I don't know if you know this or not, multiple police stations around the country still have something analogous to a Red Squad?
I lived in New York City for almost 40 years, so that's my point of reference. After 9/11, they gave a lot more power to their intelligence division. I mean, they actually brought in some old CIA people to work in it. This was the post 9/11 world. So, and it was, it was reconstructed from the ruins of the old Red Squad. I mean, you can't underestimate what a calamity it was for a lot of these institutions in the mid 70s into the early 80s when it started getting exposed. What they were doing, which was in blatant violation to, set legal laws. I know in New York, there was a consent decree called the Handshoe decision that, revealed all the records. I think Abby Hoffman and a bunch of other people were involved in it, and it, limited what the NYPD could do. And the NYPD was always straining against those limits. And I think post 9/11, it was able to take things further. I think in the contemporary era, I think you're going to see this even more. Right now, it seems like white supremacists, white extremists are in the metaphorical crosshairs. But, there's a whole thing of a history of establishing laws against a pariah group and then using it against people who are, more or less well, not more or less, who are actually engaging in protected, speech activities and such. So to answer your question, yes, but it's not the same. And it kind of goes back to the thing you said earlier. It's, I don't have any evidence the FBI is doing COINTELPRO like they did. But you can be sure that these methods, are being, instituted. Actually, it's funny. The Naval War College actually has our second book, A Threat of the First Magnitude, in their library, which I take as, I guess, a compliment, but I'm not sure.
Interesting, for sure.
Well, I think one thing is part of to help understand this, even if we don't know exactly what's going on right now in relation to these, because for one, it's not a coordinated federal thing like the FBI is I think part of it is the word COINTELPRO gets thrown around in ways that can be slightly misleading and confusing. So there's a difference actually between intelligence gathering and counterintelligence, and maybe we can get into that later. But are they gathering intelligence? Yes. Are they doing counterintelligence? I don't know that I would exactly classify even some of the most brutal Red Squad stuff as counterintelligence, just because I actually don't think it's as sophisticated as that. I think it's just more violent and brutal. It's much more arresting people on flimsy charges, incredibly trumped up charges, throwing people in jail, jacking people up, brutalizing them, shootouts, and all these sort of things. The FBI is much more concerned about much more big picture things in terms of dividing groups, creating fissures between leadership, trying to undermine groups in the eyes of possible followers.
I see. Yeah, and speaking to the trumped up charges aspect of police departments, Fred Hampton was well known. He got locked up for ostensibly stealing $70 worth of ice cream and was initially sentenced, I think, to 2 to 5 years, depending on the appeal process. So that just speaks to that point for sure. But moving on, can you talk a little bit about the FBI documents regarding Black nationalist hate groups and their fears surrounding a Black Messiah, what that stood for in their minds as a fear that they had?
All right. So there's a couple of things on this. So one is there's a little confusion around this because initially when we first found out about this document, it was very heavily redacted. So we didn't actually know who he was referencing. But now, later on, the document has come out unredacted. We actually know who he is talking about, right?
So can I just put in a note here? This is there were 2 documents released. One, I believe, in late '67 and one in March 1968. The counterintelligence program had been developed against the Communist Party, but as the '60s started to unfold, the FBI established something called a counterintelligence against Black nationalist hate groups. And they had 2 memos. And the second memo is the famous one that mentions a Black Messiah. And I think that's what Connor's speaking to here.
Yeah, so this is the March 1968, and essentially identifies part of the other thing is it also mentions that these people that aspire to, I'll get into a second who the FBI is most worried about, but they essentially identify Martin Luther King Jr., Elijah Muhammad, and they said Malcolm X would be this type of person, but he was already dead. And essentially, the thing is they're not that worried about Elijah Muhammad because they think he's old. King, they think only if he actually changes and quote unquote loses the obedience of sort of the white audience. The person he's actually concerned about is Stokely Carmichael, and that's the one he actually identifies. And this all partially comes from actually understanding COINTELPRO, right? So when we say COINTELPRO, it's often uses this big umbrella term, but these are actually specific programs with specific targets, right? So it starts in 1956 targeting the Communist Party, and then there's a second one opened up, and that's around Puerto Rican independence. There's a third one opened up that's around the Socialist Workers' Party. And the key to understanding these is it's not that they weren't maintaining tabs on these people. Sometimes they had phone taps, sometimes they had intelligence gathering, sometimes they had informants. But to actually understand what makes COINTELPRO different, it's actually an attempt to consciously disrupt these organizations, possibly from uniting with other organizations or sort of destroying them from within. And this is important because sometimes people think, oh, like a phone tap is counterintelligence. And that's not counterintelligence. That's just intelligence. And so like an example of this would be one of the earlier things the FBI tried, which they would sort of use some of these techniques later, was they'd had a COINTELPRO that they started against the Communist Party in 1956. And in 1966, they tried this thing within that COINTELPRO called Operation Hoodwink, where they essentially tried to pit the Communist Party against the New York Mafia and other aspects of other mafias, right? So they basically called it an operation of the CP against the La Cosa Nostra, right? And their idea was, by having both these groups that they weren't crazy about, and obviously the mob doesn't really like communists, they thought they could sort of create tension, right? So they did things like poison pen letters, where they do something like write a letter that claimed was written by the CP that essentially blamed the La Cosa Nostra for a bombing at Communist Party headquarters, right? Now, it wasn't actually very successful because the Communist Party didn't take the bait, but this is where they sort of began to practice and do these things. And the important thing is that COINTELPRO is really much more anchored in how terrorized and fearful they were of communists, right? They've been keeping tabs on Socialist Workers' Party as early as 41, but they developed the COINTELPRO in 61. Why? Because now they feel like they have a connection to Cuba, right? Because if you actually look at a lot of the early COINTELPROs and you get familiar with the filing number, a lot of it comes under 105, which is what they basically deem as foreign counterintelligence, right? It's the idea that they're terrified that not only are these people communists, but they have connections to the Soviet Union, they have connections to Cuba. When they really got their fear of the new left, it had to be with the fact that they were connection to China, right? And so even though they would end up opening a COINTELPRO against Black nationalist hate groups, as they deemed it, or Black nationalists, as we would call it, in 1968, even a lot of that is still very much connected to the FBI's fear of communism, right? So when we actually talk most famously about the COINTELPRO documents related to Martin Luther King, those are actually within the CP COINTELPRO, because the FBI was really concerned about Communist Party's infiltration into the Southern and the SCLC, right? And so sometimes people will take this as, oh, Hoover's just paranoid. Oh, he thinks everyone's a Red. He didn't think King was a Red. He was actually concerned that communists were infiltrating these other groups. And part of this is because I think many people on the left have gotten very defensive about some things of the past. And there's a certain amount of people taking the red bait, as it were, is if you look at every important struggle in the 20th century, communists were integral and involved in every single one of it. And people sort of just want to be like, oh, no, Hoover's paranoid. Oh, he thinks there's Reds under the beds and there's Reds in every closet. And it sort of is, and because of people trying to go that route, people have sort of undermined actually the role that communists have played in all important struggles in the 20th century. And that's what Hoover was concerned about. He didn't actually think King was a communist. He was concerned about the influence communists would have on people like King. And that's why he's worried about someone like that possibly rising to national influence and actually being uniting and electrifying force.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I want to jump on that too, because look, I just finally got around to reading the Jakarta Method, and I think your listeners, would appreciate the perspective. COINTELPRO has become shorthand for the FBI in the 60s. COINTELPRO was a fraction of what they did, and it's very sensational. I mean, they did this nasty stuff to Gene Seberg. They tried to start a gang war between the Chicago Panthers and Hampton. They did a letter to King, which, some have interpreted as trying to get him to kill himself. I mean, this is pretty awful stuff. But, the Jakarta Method outlines the lists, right? The list of communists that are made in Indonesia, in Chile, in Brazil, sometimes with the help of the CIA. Well, the FBI, a lot of what they're doing is compiling lists in the United States, list of communists, list of key Black extremists, list of agitators. Now, these lists were meant, they were actionable things. They were meant to actually round people up in the event of a justifiable, in their terms, national emergency. That did not happen. Now, had that happened, I think we would be talking about the FBI's work in this period from a different perspective, and probably we'd be a little bit more, have a little bit different context of the COINTELPRO stuff. And I'm not minimizing how terrible it was, but to say that it was piece in a larger effort of, aggressive defense of national security in which, there were no holds barred, in the words of the former Director for National Security, William Sullivan. And, in other words, COINTELPRO, because it's so fantastic, tends to draw people's attention. But I would encourage people to take, an overall picture of it and stuff, because that's actually going to be more helpful in navigating, the challenges for people who are engaged in legal activity of dissent and such today.
Yeah. Another great corrective, absolutely. So I know on Rev Left that we've done an entire episode on Fred Hampton, which I'll definitely link to in the show notes for anybody listening who hasn't heard that yet. But can you remind us of how the assassination of Fred Hampton went down and what that reveals about the FBI and the Chicago Police Department?
Yeah, so in reviewing it, it seems like Jacoby Williams wrote a book about the Illinois Black Panther Party, which has some helpful stuff in it. He makes a point that a little too often the Chicago police are emphasized in their role. I mean, it seems this actually comes out in the movie too. It seems like in the middle of November there's a shootout. I mean, Conor kind of made a point. Well, Conor made a very good point in a conversation we were having not long ago about, and maybe he can elaborate on it later. But the escalating violence between the Black Panthers and the Chicago police and law enforcement in general. I mean, they were caught in a certain loop that was extremely volatile and dangerous. But 2 Panthers are killed in the middle of November. One of them is actually shot point blank. The sense is it's the cop is on the ground. He's wounded. He's suffering, and it's some people have interpreted it as almost a mercy killing. By this, I'm sorry, I forget the man's name, but the character Winter in the film.
Jake Winters is the Panther gets killed, and the 2 officers that killed are Gahuli and Rappaport.
Yeah. So William O'Neill in his denouement on the thing says that the raid on Panther headquarters was in retaliation for that the Chicago police wanted blood. And they wanted to get the leader of the Chicago Panthers. It's a compelling version, as I say. It's nobody's on record as saying as such, but with the sanctioning of the Illinois Attorney General Edward Hanrahan, I believe that's his title. There is a raiding party. Let's see, I have the numbers. I don't want to lead people astray. I think it's 15 police go in. There are 9 Panthers in the apartment. Everybody's asleep. It's in the early morning hours, the pre-dawn hours. They go in, 90 shots are fired. It goes on from anywhere to 10 to 15 minutes, depending on whose version you read. 2 Panthers are killed. Mark Clark, who is a young Panther from, I believe, Peoria, Illinois, and Fred Hampton, who is the chairman of the group. Hampton appears to have been wounded, or it's not even clear he's dead. You hear some crosstalk from the cops, and you hear some shots, and the cop says he's good and dead now, I believe is the quote. So it appears to be an actual execution. Of the 90 shots fired, only 1 comes from the Black Panthers, although the police initially claim it was a firefight. And this is where what the FBI know, what did the FBI know and when did they know it? I mean, they issue these memos. They are very happy about William O'Neill and the work he's doing for Roy Mitchell. In June of that year, Mitchell is also commended for his work with a key informant. So, do the FBI know that the Chicago police are going in there to murder Fred Hampton? We don't know that. Are they happy that Fred Hampton is dead? Yes, they are. And it's really pretty sick when you think about it. I mean, we don't know if it's whatever. I'm kind of losing my train of thought. So, right. So Hampton is killed, and then the whole thing starts to come unwound. The Panthers actually secure the apartment, show that some of the things that were supposed to be bullet holes are actually nail holes. It becomes clear that the police, did all the firing, and Hampton is dead. Hampton at that point was actually confronting going back to prison. I mean, he had actually been convicted on the charge of looting the ice cream truck. His appeal had been denied. He was facing 2 to 5 years in prison, which, and the other thing, no, this is going back to my train of thought. What I discovered is, I think it was, there's a memo from November, I'm going to say 29th. When we publish this article, we're going to put the documents up too. The FBI actually had a formal COINTELPRO operation aimed at Fred Hampton, set to go a week or two before he was killed. A COINTELPRO was like, you had to draft the idea, it had to go up the chain of command, it had to be approved, and then it could be done. What they wanted to do was, Hampton was being called to move to Oakland because his speaking skills were such that the National Black Panthers wanted to, use that to grow their organization. But the Chicago branch was suffering from some discipline issues. There had been a meeting in which Hampton had unilaterally said, okay, everybody's purged. And, really that meant everybody was suspended. So the FBI came up with this scheme of writing a letter allegedly from an angry Chicago Panther to the Oakland headquarters saying, we're getting sick and tired of Hampton, pushing his weight around. And, the point being is to try to sabotage him moving out west. That actually speaks against, a whole scenario of the FBI, being from the very first out to get Hampton killed, which is not to say, it's not possible. It's possible whoever proposed this COINTELPRO wasn't in the loop on some things, but it is, as I say, a piece of evidence that merits further looking into and does raise larger questions around, what we do and don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for one thing, the raid was actually supposed to happen earlier. So that would have actually been before, that would have been much closer to the time after the death of the two officers, right? So the earliest, probably goes back earliest, the earliest I could find of sort of trumped up charges that the police were going after the Panthers with was February 1969. This is essentially where 4 Panthers rent 4 hotel rooms and they have some sort of meeting. And so then they have, they put like 15 people in there, and then they're essentially arrested, like 13 of them arrested on this trumped up charge of not like ripping off an innkeeper because supposedly too many people in the room. And these are sort of ridiculous trumped up charges, right? And these things just sort of escalate to the point of June 10th, you have like the morning of, you have a trio of police raids. The police are getting more and more brutal. Now, one of the key turning points will be in July 16th, 1969. This will be when a Panther, Larry Robertson, is shot 3 times, and then 2 officers are also wounded. And the police obviously take this as an insult, as an affront, the idea that they've been harassing these Panthers for a month, and now some of the fellow officers are wounded. That means they only intensify the pressure on the Panthers. And that's when we then get this period where there starts being shootouts at the office. And the police just give claims that seem rather implausible, like police were driving by a Panther office and they started a shootout. Seems like a pretty bad idea to start a shootout from your own office. Or like a sniper went after them and the sniper was on top of the Panther office. And these just become excuses, it seems like, for the police to launch more brutality in trying to deal with the Panthers, right? And at the same time, the FBI is, as Aaron just mentioned, is trying to develop things like these COINTEL programs where they can essentially push Hampton out of the way. They also seem to be given the impression that when Hampton is going to have to go back to jail on the $71 ice cream charge, as we'll call it, they more or less seem to think that he's going to be at least somewhat out of the way, and they're sort of happy with that as a solution. Whereas once we get the killings of officers Gooley and Rappaport, as well as the killings of Winters, the Panther member, that's when the police seem to be determined that they are going to basically just bring all hell down on the Panthers, and there will be blood to pay for the fact that 2 officers are dead.
Yeah, and the story from the Chicago Police Department after the fact, I think, testifies to that in relation to these other sort of events where they're saying, the snipers are shooting at us or we're just driving by and get shot at. I mean, the Chicago Police Department's, their story after the fact was that this was a mutual shootout and not an ambush and bombardment by the Chicago police, which forensics later made very clear. I mean, 99 of those bullets out of 100 of those bullets were fired from the Chicago Police Department directly. So, it all matches up for sure. Now, I want to move into the end of this conversation, but focusing on this new film because, now we have an idea of the documents, of some of the actions of the Chicago Police Department and the FBI. And this is all depicted dramatically in the new film, Judas and the Black Messiah. So I was really curious as to what both of your thoughts are on the film, what they got right, what they got wrong, and just your overall takeaway.
Yeah, I'm not sure Connor's seen it. He's
it's I'm in Shanghai, and it's not playing over here.
Oh, okay. Aaron, then.
Yeah, I have seen it. But just one thing to add in, I don't.
Sure.
I mean, we are arguing that there are more things to learn, but that is not to say, there are not certain things we know. We know William O'Neill gave, and this is in the film, and it's accurate to a degree, William O'Neill gave a floor plan to his FBI handler, Roy Mitchell. Mm-hmm. It's actually not the first floor plan he gave to Mitchell, by the way. I think he helped in the other raids, but he gave a floor plan to Mitchell, and Mitchell passed that on to the Chicago police. The attorneys, Jeff Haas and Flint Taylor, they fought like mad to get even that amount of evidence out, by bringing a civil suit, to their credit. And that's why we know that William O'Neill essentially helped that raid, be accomplished. So in that sense, William O'Neill has blood on his hands, Roy Mitchell has blood on his hands, and J. Edgar Hoover have blood on his hands, regardless of what they thought was going to happen or what they didn't think was going to happen. They were complicit. The fact that Hoover gave a bonus to both, well, I don't know if Hoover gave the bonus to O'Neill. O'Neill was given a $300 bonus through the FBI hierarchy. Mitchell was given a $200 bonus, and a nice letter from Hoover himself. The fact that, two black men are dead and that Hoover wants to give money to the people who are instrumental in them being killed it's just monstrous, regardless of what he did or didn't know. So I want to make that clear. As far as the film, the film is very powerful. I think there's a lot to be recommended there. I'm not going to go into a whole critique because it's a thing that requires a good deal more thought and methodological discerning than I'm able to do right now. Mm-hmm. I will say, though, I would urge people to watch the film as a dramatic piece of art, not as a piece of history. There's quite a bit there that's accurate. There's quite a bit that's not accurate. But it was occurring to me, two things. Fred Hampton as a messiah. I think the first point needs to be made is there's kind of a logical question mark here. It's like, why would Fred Hampton be the guy that you murder? Why wouldn't it be Huey Newton or Eldridge Cleaver or David Hilliard or Bobby Seale? The film actually has a little thing at the end, and you can see it's actually defensive. They have the Hoover character saying, oh, well, we can't let Fred go to jail because Huey was in jail and he became famous, and Eldridge was in jail and he became a famous writer. And, that's all true. But, they were still around. They were still around when Fred Hampton was murdered. So it's kind of like that argument on its own doesn't really satisfy the thing. But I think the bigger point I had is, first, there is no Messiah. There's nobody who's going to come down from heaven and lead us out of all of this. There are going to be better leaders, hopefully strong leaders. But the other thing is, and this is kind of, almost a personal note, I guess, but, I worked with the RCP for a long time, and I got to tell you that the leaders and, what Maoists used to call, and I'm a lapsed Maoist, I'm not there anymore, but leaders and the masses are dialectically intertwined. And if you skew the dialectic towards special leaders, problems often ensue. So, I don't think canonizing anybody in particular is really what we ought to be doing. We ought to be recognizing people who have special qualities and skills and to make sure that they're not made vulnerable, because they do tend to be targets. But at the same time, I think this whole, particularly when you think of countries like the former Soviet Union and China and the whole cult of personality around those figures, it never turns out well. So, a bit of sobriety around that. That said, I think the fact that people love Fred Hampton and love what he represented, this young dynamic leader who was willing to be theoretical, in challenging things, I think that's a wonderful thing for people to really acknowledge and historically appreciate and such. But the film as a whole, it's a drama, right? And some of the things are drawn very simplistically. It's the evil FBI and the courageous Black Panthers and the ambivalent, conflicted informant. And I don't think that's quite how real life goes, but people will disagree with me.
Yeah. No, and I think your point about the dialectical relationship between the people and the leaders is something that Fred Hampton himself would completely be the first one to agree with. He was never someone who put himself above and beyond others. He was always saying that he is inexorably intertwined with the community, the people, the masses that he represented. So I think that's a very important point. And any time on any side of the spectrum, but specifically on the left, where whether the leader wants it or not, there is a cult of personality. It never goes well. And I think that's something that we could always take away from this as well. Before we wrap up here, though, is there anything else that either one of you want to say before we leave this conversation? Anything you really want to ensure maybe that listeners take away from this overall conversation and episode?
I had this point at the top, and there is no evidence that the murder of Fred Hampton was a COINTELPRO operation in the sense of it, a proposal being made, approved, and carried out. Those who describe it as such, and it's pretty much out there, and I don't think we'll ever win the debate. I think people are going to forever feel that it's that way. But those describing it as such are actually misapprehending what COINTELPRO was. And that doesn't mean that the FBI doesn't have blood on its hand. It does. Mm-hmm. And this new evidence shows this definitively. But the reason I'm even making a point about this is that we need to understand COINTELPRO and the larger work of the FBI because it is a template for domestic repression. Understanding it incorrectly is only going to heighten the vulnerability to tried and true methods for people who are engaged in legal dissent or legal efforts for social justice. We need to be, as they say, we need to be smart people, mm-hmm. And not go for easy answers. So if anything, from listening to Conor and I, who, we're still wrestling with this. And I can't speak for Conor, but I know my thinking on this continues to, change, evolve sometimes, or radically transform. But it's, based on digging into and trying to get at this stuff. And a certain sense of outrage that these secrets are still being hidden. Mm. How dare they?
Yeah.
How dare they do these things and still keep it secret? To be on a mission to get that out, well, that's not such a bad mission.
Absolutely. Conor?
Yeah, I'll just sort of piggybacking off that. I think it's really important I think we need to be quite self-critical. I mean, among people who seek justice and want to get to the truth here about what we do and actually don't know. As I mentioned, we found out about COINTELPRO in 71. Blackstock wrote a book about it in 75. That was mostly focused on CWP. Churchill wrote his book, which hasn't been updated since 1988. Also, I think has some problems. But leaving that aside from that and a few other books, I don't want to give out a whole book list here, there's not been enough work done, I think, that actually honors the people who took that risk of the break-in in Media, Pennsylvania and actually unearthed this incredibly important thing. I feel a little bit like we've kind of wasted this. I mean, we should really be trying to do everything we can to get as much of this information as possible, right? There is this question being hidden, but there's also a thing on us, right? They're not just going to give it to us. And I think we really need to pull this apart, right? Because the FBI was meticulously documenting this. And there's two aspects. One is we actually need to figure out more of what the FBI, what did and didn't know, what but also it actually tells us a lot more about what was going on in terms of this information, right? Because what actually, because they were having informants in all these places and they were giving daily reports, is there's actually all this historical information that we've sort of lost, right? And back to this Messiah point for a second, right? Is I think we need to actually deal with the reality of what we did and did not accomplish, what our strengths and weaknesses are, right? Because initially, when these things around Martin Luther King's extramarital affairs came around, right? A person that was close to him, his name escapes me, he basically got trashed in the press, and now we all know it's true. It doesn't take away the point of what he did or didn't accomplish or what he was fighting for, right? We just need to actually have a realistic thing. And I think sometimes, like getting back to this Messiah point of Hoover used the term, but I think also there is too much among certain people at the left. If we want to put all our hopes in this person or this group, it's the idea that we romanticize it in the way that that's somehow going to solve things or free us. And there's a lot of hard work we have to do. I mean, I'm principally talking from the perspective of someone who's doing this as a historian, but there's just a lot of work to be done to actually figure out these things. And I think whenever we think, oh yeah, I already know that, and we don't actually have evidence, we always get ourselves in trouble and we start thinking things that actually aren't true.
Yeah, absolutely. And I applaud both of you for that commitment to realism, to being fact-based, evidence-based, and to really having the right understanding so that you can move in the right way given that correct understanding. Before we wrap up, though, could you just remind us really quick, because I think this is important, about the break-in, about how these documents were ultimately sort of released to the public, because I think that's a point that often gets obscured as well in these discussions.
Yeah, there was, I forget the exact name. There's a great PBS special, and Betty Metzger has a book called The Burglary, but it was essentially a group of Catholic pacifists who broke into the resident field office in Media, Pennsylvania, the FBI. This was back when the FBI had these little hole-in-the-wall offices because they needed to have their reach everywhere. Media is, I believe, a suburb of Philadelphia. I'm not sure what the closest city is. But this group of activists broke into this, it was basically in a strip mall. They went in and they stole a bunch of FBI files. And a few of the files had this letterhead or this subject line saying counterintelligence program. I don't think that actually revealed the Hampton thing per se, but some journalists picked up on those documents, which were distributed, eventually forced the FBI to release documents on the counterintelligence program. And then the whole thing came unwound. For another day, we need to put that all in historical context. I mean, it came unwound in the context of the defeat in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. But, these brave souls basically put it all on the line to reveal these documents, and that's why we know some of these secrets that otherwise I think the FBI would have burned before anybody ever knew about them.
Yeah, it basically gave us a guide to be able to understand what to look for in future files by being able to understand the order numbers and file numbers and these sort of things.
Absolutely fascinating. So it was an act of civil disobedience that even opened up this closet in the first place. Thank you both for coming on, for doing this in such short notice. You both do great work. The FOIA request that you have and bring to light and bring to my audience as well is deeply appreciated. I love both of the books that you've worked on and everything you do independently. Before I let you go, can you please let listeners know where they can find your work and your upcoming article and the related documents?
So the two books to look for in particular on this are Heavy Radicals and A Threat of the First Magnitude. If you go to my website, Conor and my work is there. It's aaronleonard.net, aaronleonard.net. You can find a bunch of information there. We've submitted the article to a publication, but haven't gotten confirmation. So I don't want to name them because I don't want to embarrass myself. But when it runs, Brett, I'll be sure to let you know so you can maybe attach a link to this broadcast.
Absolutely, yeah. The moment that comes out, I'll link to it in the show notes. I'll update it and I'll get the word out. Conor, where can we find you?
Nowhere, because the country's absolutely abhorrent handling COVID has made it so I don't get any NARA files anymore. So when the country occasionally gets back to something that looks like a functioning country, I might be able to get files again and give you guys some articles.
Awesome. All right. Well, until then, thank you both for coming on, and we'll definitely have you back anytime. You know you have a home here at Rev Left.
Okay, thanks for having us, Fred.